The latest interview involving Nolan Wells' friend, Javon Williams, has raised even more questions about what happened on Horn Island before Nolan disappeared. Williams says he saw Nolan that day. He says they spoke, and he remembers Nolan telling him that he loved him. But now viewers are focusing on something else. The different accounts surrounding the boat, the disputed video, Nolan's phone, and what happened in the hours before he was found. And there is one question that keeps coming back. If Nolan was with friends on the island, why did he end up separated from them? And why were there so many conflicting accounts about what happened before he went missing? And before we get into the latest details, welcome to the channel. If you're following Nolan's story with us, please subscribe and stay with us as we continue looking closely at what happened. According to the account in the supplied reporting, Nolan Wells traveled with a group of friends to Horn Island, an island located roughly 10 miles from the Mississippi mainland. The trip took place around the 4th of July, when the group was spending time on the beach and in the water. At some point that afternoon, an altercation was reportedly said to have taken place. Nolan would later be reported missing at around 4 p.m. That timeline matters because there are several details that do not fit neatly together. One of them involves Nolan's phone. Information discussed in the reports indicated that Nolan's phone was not with him when he was found in the water, and questions were raised about why the phone was left on a boat rather than remaining with Nolan. His friends also gave different accounts about the events surrounding his disappearance. Then there was the video, a recording circulated online that some people believed captured Nolan involved in an argument. The audio appeared to include someone demanding that another person return his phone. But Javon later said he did not believe the person in that video was Nolan. According to Javon's account, another friend had been involved in an altercation on the boat. Javon said that person was being held back and that people were attempting to get him off the island because he was becoming increasingly upset. That distinction is important. Because if the video was not Nolan, then a piece of material that many people online were using to understand the final hours of his life may have been connected to someone else entirely. And that is where this case becomes difficult to follow. There are multiple versions of events circulating at the same time. Some people online have focused on race because Nolan was reportedly the only black person in the group of white friends he traveled with. Others, including Javon, have pushed back against the idea that race explains what happened. But regardless of what anyone believes about that issue, there is a much simpler question that investigators still have to answer. What happened between the time Nolan was last seen and the time his absence became known? Javon said he was supposed to be on the same boat as Nolan, but the boat became full, so he traveled separately. He still saw Nolan on the island. According to Javon's statement, the last time he saw Nolan was close to 4 p.m. And there was another detail. Javon said that he and Nolan spoke when they were on the island, and Nolan told him, "I love you." Those words have taken on a painful meaning because Javon would not see his friend alive again. Another friend, Trace Carter, reportedly spoke to Nolan before the trip and told him to be careful. Carter's message was simple: contact him when he returned. Nolan reportedly answered that he would. There was also information suggesting Nolan knew how to swim and had taken swimming lessons at a IMCA in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. That detail does not prove that anything criminal happened, but it has become part of the discussion because it raises another question about the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. If Nolan knew how to swim, what exactly happened in the water? And if he was last seen with friends, what happened between that final sighting and the discovery of his body? Then we come back to Javon. His recent public comments have drawn attention because he knew Nolan well, was present on the island that day, and has been asked directly about what he saw. In one interview, he said that he did see Nolan on the island. That statement is straightforward. But the questions became more complicated when the conversation turned toward the video circulating online and the identity of the person heard arguing. Javon maintained that the argument was connected to another friend, not Nolan. He described that other friend as becoming hostile and said people on the boat were trying to calm him down and get him back toward land. Yet according to the supplied script, investigators had apparently not contacted Javon at that point to ask him about what he personally witnessed. That is another detail that deserves attention. If someone knew Nolan, saw him on the island that afternoon, and was familiar with the people around him, why had that person apparently not been interviewed by investigators? There may be a perfectly ordinary explanation. The investigation could have been proceeding in stages. Officials may have already had information that has not been made public, and the absence of a public interview does not mean investigators ignored the witness. But from the outside, it naturally leaves people asking questions. And those questions became even more intense when Javon's interview was examined closely, because viewers began focusing not only on what he said, but on the way he responded when asked about Nolan. That is where the story takes another turn. A later interview brought Javon, Nolan's family, and others into the conversation. During that interview, Javon was asked whether he remembered seeing Nolan on the 4th of July. His answer was clear. Yes, he said, he had seen Nolan on the island. But immediately afterward, viewers began debating the interaction between Javon and his mother. Some interpreted a movement from his mother as a nudge telling him to be careful about what he said. Others may see the same moment differently. And that distinction is important. A gesture on camera cannot, by itself, establish what someone was thinking or what they intended. But it can raise a question worth examining. Why did that moment attract so much attention? And what, if anything, did Javon know that day that has not yet been fully explained? Those are the questions surrounding the recent interview, and they bring us back to the central mystery of Nolan Wells' final hours. The boat, the phone, the disputed argument, the last known sighting, and the conflicting accounts from people who were there. The more closely those pieces are examined, the more important the timeline becomes. Because before anyone can determine what happened to Nolan, investigators first have to establish exactly what happened in those final hours. The timeline becomes even more complicated when we look closely at what the people around Nolan said happened on the island. One of the biggest questions is why Nolan would have remained behind while the rest of the group prepared to leave. According to the statements discussed in the supplied material, Javon said he did not believe Nolan was the type of person who would simply decide to stay behind while his friends returned without him. That may sound like a small detail, but when you are trying to reconstruct someone's final known movements, small details can become important. Javon described Nolan as someone who normally returned with the people he arrived with. He questioned the idea that Nolan would willingly remain on the island, especially without making sure he had his phone. And that brings us back to the phone. Why was it left behind? Why wasn't Nolan carrying it when he disappeared? And who had access to it after Nolan was last seen? Those questions have circulated because the phone could potentially help establish a timeline. A phone can show communication, location information, photographs, messages, or other activity, depending on what investigators are able to recover. But the material we have does not establish what investigators ultimately found on Nolan's phone. So it is important not to turn that unanswered question into a conclusion. What we can say is that the phone became one of the details people were discussing when they tried to understand what happened. There was another complication: the argument seen in the video. Javon said the person heard in that recording was another friend, not Nolan. He explained that the friend had become involved in an altercation and that people were trying to calm him down. That explanation would seem to settle the issue, except that other people had interpreted the recording differently. Some believed the voice sounded like Nolan. And once a recording begins circulating online, it can be extremely difficult to separate what is actually heard from what people expect to hear. That is why identifying the person in the video matters. If it was Nolan, then the recording could potentially provide information about his state of mind shortly before he disappeared. If it was another person, then the video may have been drawing attention away from the actual sequence of events. At this point, the supplied material does not establish the identity of the person in the recording with certainty. Javon's own explanation was that it was another friend, but there were still questions about the details surrounding that altercation. What started the argument? Who was involved? Why did people need to restrain the person? And how close in time was that incident to Nolan's disappearance? Those questions matter because the events were reportedly happening in the same general environment, involving people from the same group. Then came another issue that attracted attention: whether investigators had spoken with Javon. During the interview, Javon indicated that law enforcement had not spoken to him about what he witnessed. The interviewer found that surprising. After all, Javon knew Nolan. He had been on the island that day. He had seen Nolan close to the time he disappeared, and he knew several of the people who had been around Nolan. Javon responded that he did not understand why police would necessarily need to speak with him. That response is worth putting into context. Not being publicly interviewed does not prove that investigators were ignoring him. It does not prove that the investigation was mishandled, and it certainly does not prove that anyone was hiding information. But it does show how much uncertainty existed around the case from the perspective of people following it. There was another statement that added to the confusion. Javon said Nolan was seen with a girl while they were among the other people on the island. That detail has significance because it relates to the question of whether Nolan intentionally separated himself from the group. If Nolan willingly went somewhere with someone he knew, that would create one possible explanation for his movements. But if he was separated from the group under circumstances they did not fully understand, then the timeline looks different. The problem is that the available material does not give us enough information to resolve that question. And that is exactly why the statements from the people who were there matter so much. Another friend, identified in the material as Tristan, reportedly said the disputed video was actually connected to him. He said the person heard demanding his phone was him. Javon also appeared to support that explanation, saying the voice sounded like Tristan and that people were trying to calm him down. But even there, the conversation became tangled. If the video involved Tristan, then the circumstances of his altercation need to be understood separately from Nolan's disappearance. Was it a completely unrelated argument? Did it happen earlier? Was Nolan nearby? And did anyone in that group later describe the incident differently? These are the kinds of questions that a detailed investigation would have to separate. There is also the question of what happened after Nolan was no longer with the group. According to the material, the group did not immediately report Nolan missing while they were still preparing to leave the island. Instead, questions were raised about why the missing person report did not happen until they had returned home. That detail has become one of the most troubling points for people following the case. If a group realizes that one of its members is missing on an island, the natural question is what happens next. Do they search the shoreline? Do they call his name? Do they contact emergency services? Do they stay behind? Do they call his family? The supplied material raises concerns about the timing of the report, but it does not provide enough evidence to explain exactly why the group made the decisions they did. And that distinction matters. A delay can be suspicious to observers, but there may be information that has not been publicly released. Still, the timing is something investigators would need to examine carefully, because every minute matters when reconstructing a disappearance. Then there is Javon's behavior during the later interview. Some commentators focused heavily on his facial expressions and on the moment his mother appeared to touch or nudge him. Some interpreted the gesture as a warning. Others saw it simply as a parent reacting to a difficult interview. There is no reliable way to determine someone's intention from a brief gesture alone. But the moment became part of the larger conversation because people were already questioning whether the accounts from the people around Nolan were consistent. And this is where we need to slow down. A contradiction does not automatically mean someone is lying. People remember stressful events differently. Interviews happen at different times. A person may misunderstand a question, forget a detail, or describe something differently after hearing information from other people. But when several details appear to shift, investigators have to compare those accounts carefully. What did each person say immediately after the incident? What did they say later? What details remained consistent, and which details changed? Those comparisons may eventually tell us more than any single interview. For Nolan's family, however, these are not simply questions on a timeline. They are questions about what happened to someone they loved. And that is what makes the continuing uncertainty so difficult. There are still several pieces that do not fit neatly together. Nolan's final movements, the phone, the disputed video, the reported altercation, the people he was with, and the timing of the missing person report. None of those details, by themselves, establishes foul play. But together, they explain why so many people continue asking for clearer answers. And there is one issue that may be more important than all the online speculation. If the people who were physically present on that island remember the final hours differently, investigators need to determine exactly where those stories intersect and where they separate. Because somewhere inside that timeline may be the answer to what happened to Nolan Wells. As the questions surrounding Nolan Wells's final hours continue, one thing becomes increasingly important: separating what is actually known from what people believe happened. The available accounts leave us with several confirmed pieces of the timeline. Nolan was on Horn Island with friends around the 4th of July. He was seen there that afternoon. Javon Williams said he saw him close to 4 p.m. There was reportedly an altercation involving people in the group, although Javon said the widely circulated video did not show Nolan. Nolan's phone was reportedly left on a boat, and questions were raised about why he was separated from the people he had arrived with. But there are also significant gaps, and those gaps are where the speculation has grown. Some people believe Nolan's death was the result of foul play. Others have questioned whether the available information can support that conclusion. At this point, the material we have does not establish exactly how Nolan died, or what happened during the period between his last known sighting and the discovery of his body. That distinction is important. A case can contain troubling inconsistencies without those inconsistencies automatically proving a crime. What investigators ultimately need is evidence that can be independently examined. That could include physical evidence, phone records, witness statements, forensic findings, photographs, video, or information about the boat and the people who were present. And that is why the boat itself has become such an important part of the conversation. According to the supplied material, questions were raised about whether the boat should be examined for evidence, including possible DNA. There were also questions about the phones belonging to the people who were with Nolan. Those are investigative questions, not conclusions. The fact that people online are asking whether those things were examined does not tell us whether law enforcement actually did so. What we do know is that Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter addressed the case after Nolan's body was found. His message was that the investigation would be handled like any other case, and that investigators would be thorough. That statement matters because it is the official position available in the material. The sheriff's office was not publicly declaring that Nolan's death was a murder. It was saying the case would be investigated carefully. And for a family waiting for answers, that distinction can be difficult. Because while investigators work through evidence, the public often wants an immediate explanation. Was Nolan's death an accident? Was there an altercation that played a role? Did someone know more than they initially said? Was the disputed video connected to Nolan at all? Why was his phone left behind? Why was he separated from the group? And why did the timeline surrounding the missing person report become such a major point of discussion? Those questions remain important precisely because the public information does not answer all of them. There is also another aspect of this story that should not be overlooked. Nolan's friends have been describing him as someone they cared about deeply. Javon publicly expressed his grief and described Nolan as his brother. He spoke about their calls, their conversations, and the relationship they shared. That is important because it reminds us that behind every disputed timeline and every online theory is a real family dealing with the death of someone they loved. The internet can turn a complicated case into a collection of screenshots, short clips, and competing theories. But a short video does not contain an entire investigation. A facial expression does not tell us what someone is thinking. A gesture does not establish what someone intended. And a person's account changing does not automatically prove that person is responsible for a crime. Those conclusions require evidence. What the recent interview does give us is another opportunity to compare the statements made by people who were around Nolan, and that may ultimately be more useful than the most dramatic theory circulating online. Because if investigators can establish a reliable timeline, many of these questions may become easier to answer. For example, if phone records establish where certain people were at particular times, that could help confirm or challenge parts of their statements. If video or photographs establish who was present, that could narrow the timeline. If forensic evidence reveals something significant about the boat or another location, that could provide information that interviews alone cannot. And if witnesses are interviewed separately and their accounts are compared, investigators may be able to identify which details are consistent and which require further explanation. That is the process that matters. Not simply deciding who looks suspicious, not deciding what a gesture means, not assuming that a person is guilty because their story sounds unusual. The real question is whether the evidence supports one explanation more strongly than the others. And right now, based on the material available to us, there are still unanswered questions. The most important may be the final hours. What was Nolan doing immediately before he disappeared? Who was he with? When was he last seen? What happened to his phone? What happened during the reported altercation? When did the group realize he was missing? And what did they do after they realized he was gone? Those questions form the backbone of the investigation. They also explain why the recent interview has attracted so much attention. Javon's account gives us one version of what happened. Other people have provided different details. Online viewers have interpreted the footage in different ways, and officials have said the case will receive a thorough investigation. But none of that should be confused with a final answer. There is still a difference between a suspicious detail and proof. There is a difference between an inconsistent statement and evidence of a crime. And there is a difference between what people believe happened and what investigators can establish. For Nolan's family, the hope is that the second category eventually becomes clear, that the evidence will establish what happened on that island, that the unanswered questions about the boat, the phone, the people around Nolan, and the timeline will eventually have documented answers. And perhaps the most important question for everyone following this case is a simple one. What happened during those final hours that we still do not know about? If you have followed the case, that is the question worth keeping in mind as new interviews and information emerge. Look at the timeline, compare the statements, and separate what has actually been established from what remains speculation. And most importantly, remember that Nolan was a person, not simply a headline or an internet mystery. His family deserves answers that are based on evidence. What do you think is the most important unanswered question in Nolan Wells' final timeline? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. And if you want to continue following this case as new information becomes available, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for future updates.